Hi guys, okay, right, good morning. These videos are meant to be, if you like, flip learning, um, sort of revision and areas you can always go back to, and but I will go through these in the lecture, and you'll see they'll pretty much be a match for what we're talking about in class. Yes, so that's just to make sure you have something to always refer to. Okay, great. The program starts off reviewing a few topics in chapter one, and that's what we're going to sort of go through quickly. So let's begin. So yes, here we are. Here we are. So it starts off looking at the purposes of costing, and and when I say costing, really, I suppose what we should really be saying is, I mean, I guess the technical term for costing nowadays, we have gone through everything from calling it management accounting to cost accounting, and if you like, this idea of having a sort of steward or someone in charge or foreman, if you like. So think about foremen evolving, if you like, in what we refer to today as um, management accountants who have evolved, if you like, to performance managers, ultimately performance evaluators, if you like. So we have an evolving system here where we've moved from your traditional labor cost management to something rather more holistic. So typically, your classic idea is behind. I mean, you could almost argue that the same reasons behind budgeting, or the same reasons why we budget, are the same reasons why we cost almost. This idea of being able to make decisions and understanding what raw materials are bought in and in what quantities we will explore. Sometimes, so typically think we're in the world of manufacturing. So think of the idea that sometimes it's cheaper to actually make some. Sorry, it's cheaper to buy something and then to make it. And if it's cheaper to buy a raw material in, then it is to sort of, when I say raw material, a component, I should say, in, then it is cheaper to couple together some raw materials. Then you sort of you would need to know, and having that analysis then tells you, because of course this is going to go into your final product and therefore determine your overall cost, and so what you're trying to minimize, isn't it? So stewardship, again, ultimately management accounting has always been the sort of precursor or the prep work for the reporting via financial accounts. So the final reports that are presented, final accounts, actually do come from the work done in management accounting, the material kept in management accounting. Classic within manufacturing, this question of valuation of inventory. IAS 2 says that inventory must always be recognized at the lower of cost and net realizable value. So in terms of cost, as far as manufacturing is concerned, we're talking about the production costs. And when we say production costs, the raw materials and the overheads involved, the factory overheads involved in making that. And we will expand on that a bit more, but our focus is very much on what's happening in the factory. So that's maybe your warehouse and your offices, but it's really the costs involved over here that we're interested in. And all these costs go in, if you like, into the final product. Okay, we're also very much interested in pricing. I mean, ultimately, we're in manufacturing. If we to price properly, of course, we need to cost properly. I mean, there's several things we talk about. This idea of cost and then having a markup. I mean, this is the idea of the markup. The markup comes from the world of production, where you've made something and then you put something on top of it, right, to make sure you cover all your other expenses that are non-production. So that's the whole point, ultimately, and make that markup so big that it covers all the costs in here and you still have something left, right? um, I think that's a good thing. And then of course in terms of business engineering and trying to minimize costs, and then because sometimes when I say minimize costs, because you're a price taker, so because you can't do anything about the pricing, you have to accept that. So knowing what the costs are enables you to do that. There's also, I guess, the idea of varying your price in order to penetrate markets. So understanding what the costs are, then so if you know that the cost of something is £10, then you know maybe if you're trying to you could sell it at market for 15, but you're trying to break into the market, you might go 13. But because you're aware of 10, then you know you're still making 3. That sort of idea. Right. I'm sure from memory you remember that in terms of elements, we classify costs either as direct or indirect, and direct costs being, if you like, elements what we can actually see. We can actually see the cost in the product. So the raw materials and labor. These are our traditional direct costs, and as opposed to our indirect costs, which we also refer to as our overheads. So this is some examples of these materials, labor, indirect costs, your light, water, heat, and that sort of thing. Now, of course, we talk about controlling costs and anything. If you're going to be able to control something, you need to understand its behavior. Understand its behavior. So costs are either classified as fixed or as variable. And of course, if you remember the nice graphs we used to put once upon a time, things like that, we have costs that these are your fixed costs, that this is your activity. Costs that do not change with the level of activity, as opposed to change here, which is your variable cost. Costs that will change with the level of activities. For every extra unit you're making, you're having an increase in your variable. Your variable costs, those are increasing, right? And here we are. So typically, of course, direct costs, like so your raw materials, of course, your labor, generally. I mean, when I say labor, here I talk about wages. Right? We'll come to the point where we in chapter 4 we'll look at situations where we're actually arguing. This is pretty important, that labor is no longer a direct cost, if you like, because most contracts nowadays are rarely per hour, but are very much salaried. And once you enter that realm of salary, that becomes a fixed cost. So ultimately, the main variable cost, if you like, becomes your direct materials. But we'll see that later on. But the general principle is that wages are still very much variable. Again, I highlight this fact that fixed costs do not change with output. Yes. And then, of course, we also look, this is critical to a lot of the things you did before in that level 4, this idea of a standard cost and creating a standard, if you like, a benchmark for us to judge things and then to kind of compare to, almost, if you like, carrying out some element of variance analysis. Right, that's kind of the principle here. So that makes sense. If you're going to be able to make judgments, you must have a benchmark of sorts. That's again coming back to these purposes of costing, from decision making to motivation to monitoring, right? So the key point is, in order to do all these things efficiently, we must be we must have a standard of sorts. So I think I'm going to make these videos in 10 minutes, so they're sort of quickly digestible, that sort of thing. So we have this fair benchmark, and why. So I sort of talk about it. So again, I talk about planning. Critical standard costs can help with budgeting. We have control, of course, and we can compare the standard cost with the actual costs and investigate any differences. Yes, again, and I mean, again, like I really, the key point here is that it acts as a benchmark. So you think of all the reasons why you would want to compare actual what happens with the standard, right? And again, like we talked about how cost accountants have moved away from being purely people who try and bring down costs to people who evaluate management and try and understand how to improve performance ultimately, because they are ultimately the people on the inside who understand how the organization works. So ultimately it's about improving the, if you like, when we say cost center, okay, what we've done here is to administratively break down the costs in the organization and ensure that people are responsible for them by creating cost centers, and therefore being able to better control or better understand what's causing or where these costs live. I mean, the standard costing, again, like I say, if you're making it, of course, the other argument here is, what is a standard cost? We talked about direct material, direct labor. You typically will have a contract, if you like, for getting your material, for making a product. You typically will have a contract with your employees, to a certain extent of labor. But the argument there becomes that, like I mentioned earlier on, you have a factory and your factory will have overheads. This is something we'll come to see soon. But the question is, these overheads have to be brought in, if you like, into the product for us to kind of, I call it direct overhead, but we need to bring it into the product to kind of finally understand what the full cost is of making a product. So in effect, we can then, well, yes, fully cost the product. But not only that, if you have this fully made and you haven't sold it yet, well, it's your manufacturing business. It's sitting in your inventory. So what is the cost of that inventory? And I mentioned that earlier on. IAS 2 is very clear on how we arrive at that value, being my material labor, and this element of overhead that has come from within the factory must be included. So you can, and again, like standard costing is really used for making lots of things. You're making a lot, so you might as well just forecast and have some benchmarks to decide. And IS2 allows you to use standard costing. I mean, of course, if you're buying and selling and you're not making the product, LIFO and FIFO and AFCO, if you like, are opportunities. But in the UK, IS2 does not allow for LIFO. Okay, we'll take a break there and we'll carry on in the next video.